I want you to picture the worst phone call you've ever received. Now multiply it by 2. Because that's what my life was. 2 phone calls, 12 years apart, that completely destroyed the floor underneath me. The first one came when I was 6 years old. I didn't answer it. I was too small to understand what the look on my aunt's face meant when she picked up. But I understood what happened after. The crying. The way the adults kept steering me out of rooms. The way nobody would look me in the eye. My parents had left the house that evening to drive to a dinner party. It was snowing, not heavily, just that light, pretty snow that makes everything look like a Christmas card. My mom had worn her red coat. I remember that specifically. Red coat, dark hair, and she'd kissed my forehead and told me to be good for Aunt Linda while they were gone. They never made it home. A drunk driver ran a red light 2 miles from the house and hit them at full speed. My dad died at the scene. My mom held on for 6 hours in the ICU before she let go too. I was 6 years old, and I was alone in the world. For about 48 hours, the adults around me whispered about what would happen next. I heard pieces of it: foster care, distant cousins, temporary arrangements. Nobody seemed to have a real answer. And nobody was talking to me. I was just this small, confused, grieving thing sitting on Aunt Linda's couch eating crackers because it was the only food I'd touch. And then my grandfather walked in. He was 65 years old, white-haired, a little stooped, with the kind of bad knees that made him wince on stairs. He'd driven 4 hours through that same snow that had taken my parents, and he walked into that house with his coat still on, and his jaw set like he'd already made a decision before he even opened the door. Someone, I think it was Aunt Linda's husband, said something about the logistics of it. About how maybe it made more sense to look at other options. About how raising a child was a lot of work for a man his age. My grandfather put his hand flat on the kitchen table. Not hard. Not angry. Just final. "She's coming with me," he said. That's the end of the conversation. And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. His name was Gerald. But I called him Grandpa Jerry, and from that day forward, he was my entire world. The first few months were an adjustment for both of us. He lived in a small house in a town about 2 hours from where I'd grown up. 3 bedrooms, a yard with an old oak tree, a kitchen that always smelled like coffee. Not fancy, not big, but it was a real home, and he made it feel like one. He gave me his bedroom, the bigger one, with the window that looked out over the backyard, and moved himself into the smaller room at the end of the hall. I didn't understand why he did that until I was older. His bed was more comfortable. The mattress in the small room was old and sagging, and he had a bad back on top of everything else. He gave me the good room because I was a little kid who'd just lost everything, and he thought it might help. It did. But there were things he didn't know how to do. He'd never raised a daughter. He'd raised my dad, just the one kid, and by all accounts my dad had been a pretty easy, low-maintenance boy who mostly wanted to be left alone with his books. He had no idea what to do with a 6-year-old girl. He didn't know how to braid hair. I remember the first morning I came downstairs with my hair a tangled mess, and he just looked at it with this expression of complete helplessness. He tried a ponytail. It was crooked. I cried. Not because of the ponytail, but because my mom used to do my hair, and the absence of her hands was suddenly unbearable. He sat me down, handed me a tissue, and said, "Give me 2 days." I didn't know what he meant. 2 days later, he sat me down in the kitchen chair and braided my hair. Not perfectly, it was a little uneven, but he did it. When I asked him how he learned, he showed me his phone. He'd watched YouTube videos. Tutorial after tutorial, practiced on a doll he'd quietly bought at the drugstore, and figured it out. I thought about that a lot as I got older. This 65-year-old man, sitting alone in his kitchen late at night, watching videos about braiding little girls' hair. Learning something completely foreign to him because I needed it, and he refused to let me down. That was who he was. He packed my lunches every single day. He showed up to every school meeting, and there were a lot of them because I went through a period in 2nd grade where I was acting out, crying at school, having these little meltdowns that the teachers didn't know how to handle. He sat in those tiny kindergarten chairs in the conference room, this big white-haired man with bad knees, and he listened, and he asked questions, and he took notes on a legal pad. He made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth showing up for. But we didn't have much money. And that was something I felt every single day. We never went on vacation. Not once. Other kids in my class went to Disney World or the beach every summer. We drove to a state park about an hour away and hiked the same trail we always hiked, and that was our version of a trip. We didn't do takeout. Other families ordered pizza on Friday nights. We had homemade soup because it was cheap and he made a lot of it. He was actually a good cook, Grandpa Jerry. But I didn't appreciate it then the way I do now. I wore secondhand clothes. He'd take me to the thrift store at the start of every school year and let me pick things out, and he was always cheerful about it. Always said I had a great eye for finding good stuff. But I knew the other girls in my class weren't wearing secondhand jeans. I knew because one of them pointed it out once in 5th grade, loudly enough for other people to hear, and the heat of embarrassment I felt in that moment burned in me for years. I had an old phone with a cracked screen. He'd gotten it secondhand too, some model that was already 2 generations behind when I got it. It worked. It made calls, sent texts. But it wasn't what the other kids had, and I felt that gap every single day. And whenever I asked for anything, the new sneakers everyone was wearing, a specific birthday gift, anything that cost real money, he'd give me this look. Patient. Gentle. But firm. We can't afford it, kiddo. I hated those words. I hated them so much. There were nights where I cried into my pillow about it. Real, genuine anger. I know how that sounds now, like a spoiled kid who didn't appreciate what she had. But I was a child, and children feel injustice acutely even when they don't fully understand their circumstances. I wasn't comparing us to rich families. I was comparing us to regular families. Normal families. And we always seemed to fall just a little short. I never said anything to him directly. He was doing his best, and some part of me knew that even then. But the resentment lived in me quietly, gathering like dust in a corner. Then 2 things happened. First, he got sick. And second comes later. Because when I tell you what I found out after he died, I need you to already understand who he was to me. I need you to feel the full weight of it. He'd been having trouble breathing for about a year before the diagnosis. He played it off. Grandpa Jerry was the kind of man who didn't complain about his body, ever. He'd had his bad knees for as long as I could remember, and he never mentioned them unless you caught him wincing on the stairs. So when he started pausing to catch his breath on walks, when he started skipping things he used to do without thinking, I noticed, but I told myself it was just age. It wasn't just age. He was diagnosed with congestive heart failure 2 months after my 17th birthday. The doctor explained it to us together, which I think Grandpa Jerry arranged on purpose. He wanted me to hear it from the source, wanted me to be able to ask questions, didn't want to be in the position of filtering information to protect me. I sat in that doctor's office and listened to words I barely understood: ejection fraction, fluid buildup, cardiac function, and watched my grandfather nod like he'd already known. Maybe he had. The next year was the hardest of my life, and I say that knowing I'd already lost both my parents at 6 years old. He declined slowly at first, then quickly. The medications helped for a while, then seemed to stop helping. He needed more rest. He couldn't make it up the stairs some days. The man who had once driven 4 hours through a snowstorm to come and claim me couldn't get from the kitchen to the living room without stopping. I took over the cooking, the grocery shopping, the appointments. I drove him everywhere. I got my license at 16 and immediately started using it for him, learning which parking spots at the hospital were closest to the entrance, memorizing which pharmacy counter was fastest. I was 17 years old, and I was his caregiver. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it so you understand. I would have done anything for him. There was no ask that was too big. No inconvenience that mattered. I just wanted him to stay. He died on a Tuesday morning in March. I was 18 by then, had just turned 18 6 weeks before. I was downstairs making coffee when it happened. He'd been sleeping more than usual, which the hospice nurse had told us to expect. I went up to check on him around 9, and he was just gone. Peaceful, the nurse said when she came. In his sleep, not in pain. I sat next to him for a long time before I called anyone. I don't know how long. Time stopped working right. The grief that followed was a different kind than losing my parents. When I lost my parents, I was 6. I didn't fully understand death. I understood absence. The missing of them was enormous, but the concept of gone forever took years to really settle into me. This time I was 18, and I understood completely. The house went quiet in a way that felt total, like all the sound had been vacuumed out. I stopped eating properly. I stopped sleeping. I'd find myself standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning with no memory of walking downstairs. People came to the funeral. People I didn't know, neighbors, old colleagues of his, a few people from his church that I'd met maybe once or twice. They all said the same kinds of things. What a good man. What a wonderful grandfather. You must be so proud. I was proud. I was also shattered. After the funeral, the relatives appeared. This is where the story gets complicated. I didn't have much family on my grandfather's side. My dad had been an only child, and Grandpa Jerry had outlived most of his siblings. But my mom's side of the family was different. I had 2 aunts and an uncle on that side, people I'd seen maybe a handful of times growing up. They weren't close with Grandpa Jerry. He wasn't their blood, after all. But they showed up after the funeral with a particular kind of energy I didn't like but couldn't name at first. Aunt Patricia was the loudest. She wore expensive clothes and spoke in this bright, carrying voice that always made her sound like she was announcing something. She hugged me at the funeral and said she was so sorry and then, within the same breath, asked about the house. "What are you going to do with the house, sweetheart?" I said I didn't know yet. "Well," she said, patting my arm, "I'm sure we'll all want to figure that out together as a family." As a family. We hadn't been a family when I was 6 and wearing secondhand clothes. We hadn't been family for the last 12 years. But now that Grandpa Jerry was gone, and there was property involved, suddenly we were family. I filed that away. 2 weeks after the funeral, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I've been getting sympathy calls from people I didn't know, friends of my grandfather's who'd found my number through the church bulletin or something, and I didn't have the energy for another one. But something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was a woman. Professional, calm, careful. "Is this Emma?" "Emma Calloway." "Yes," I said. "My name is Margaret Chun. I'm an attorney with Chun and Associates. I'm calling because I was your grandfather's attorney and I need to speak with you about his estate." I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know why. My legs just decided that was happening. "Okay," I said. "First, I want to say I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. "Gerald was a good man. I knew him for almost 15 years. 15 years. He'd never mentioned her. Not once." "Thank you," I said. "I need to meet with you in person," she said. "As soon as possible, actually. There are some things about your grandfather's estate that you need to know. Things that are somewhat complex." "Somewhat complex. Can you tell me what it's about?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "I can tell you that your grandfather made very specific arrangements and that you are the sole beneficiary of his estate." Another pause. "I can also tell you that the value of the estate is significantly larger than you may be expecting." The kitchen was very quiet. "How much larger?" I whispered. "I'd really prefer to go over the specifics in person," she said. "But, Emma, I want you to be prepared. And I want you to be careful about who you speak with before we meet. Do you understand what I mean?" I thought about Aunt Patricia's bright voice asking about the house. "I think I do," I said. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my grandfather's old bedroom. I'd moved in there after he died, because the small room at the end of the hall had started to feel wrong, and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening. My grandfather had told me, for 12 years, that we couldn't afford things. Couldn't afford new clothes. Couldn't afford a better phone. Couldn't afford takeout or vacations, or anything that wasn't strictly necessary. An attorney was calling to tell me the estate was significantly larger than I might be expecting. Those two facts didn't fit together. And then another thought arrived, quieter and more devastating. He'd lied to me. Not about big things, maybe. Not about anything that mattered the way love matters, the way showing up matters. But about money, about our circumstances, about the reason I'd spent 12 years feeling like we were just barely scraping by. Had he lied about that? Why? I went downstairs at 2 in the morning and stood in the kitchen and looked around at this house I'd grown up in. Really looked at it. The appliances were old, but good quality. The furniture was well made, just worn. The house itself was small, but it sat on a full lot in a town where property values had been rising steadily for years. What had I been missing? I started in the study. Grandpa Jerry's study was a small room off the kitchen that I'd barely gone into growing up. It was a space, and he was private about it. Not secretive, exactly. Just private. He kept the door closed, and I'd learned to respect that. I opened the door and turned on the light. The room had a desk, a filing cabinet, and shelves of books. Orderly the way he kept everything. I sat at the desk and started opening drawers. Most of it was normal. Utility bills, tax documents, medical records from the last year. I flipped through things carefully, setting them aside in piles. And then, in the bottom drawer, underneath a hanging folder labeled Miscellaneous, I found a brown accordion folder that was sealed with a rubber band. My name was written on it in his handwriting. Emma. I stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking when I pulled off the rubber band. The folder was thick, much thicker than I'd expected. On top was a letter, handwritten, several pages, in his careful block print. I started reading. Dear Emma, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Margaret has called you. I asked her to reach out within the first 2 weeks. I didn't want you sitting with questions too long. I have some things to tell you, and I want you to hear them from me, even if it's on paper and not in person. I'm sorry it has to be this way. I thought more than once about telling you sooner. But I made a promise, and I kept it as long as I could. Now that I'm gone, the promise doesn't need to be kept anymore. Your parents didn't die broke. My vision went blurry. I blinked hard and kept reading. Your father was more like me than he ever knew. He saved. He planned. He had a life insurance policy I helped him set up when he was in his 20s, before you were born, before he ever thought he'd need it. Your mother had one too. When they died, both policies paid out. The total was $890,000. I had to put the letter down. I put it face down on the desk and pressed both hands flat on the surface and just breathed for a minute. My whole body was buzzing. $890,000. I'd worn secondhand clothes. I'd carried a phone with a cracked screen. I'd cried into my pillow because we couldn't afford takeout. And there had been $890,000. I picked up the letter again. I want to explain why I didn't tell you. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But please hear me out. When your parents died, you were 6 years old. The money was in a trust that I managed as your guardian. I could have used it for anything. I could have bought a bigger house, taken you on vacations, given you everything the other kids had. There was nothing stopping me. But I knew something that took me a long time to figure out with your father. That children who grow up knowing they have money change in ways that aren't always good. They stop learning the value of things. They stop understanding what it feels like to work for something. Your mother understood this too. We had one conversation years ago when you were still just a baby about what we'd want if something happened. She told me, raise her to know who she is, without money first. I thought about her words every time you asked me for something, and I said no. Every time I watched you be disappointed, and I kept my mouth shut. It was the hardest thing I ever did. But I want you to understand something else. I invested that money, carefully over 12 years, with help from a financial advisor I trusted. I reinvested the returns. I let it grow. It is no longer $890,000. There was a pause in the letter. A new paragraph. As of the date of this letter, the trust contains $2.3 million. I stopped reading again. I got up from the desk and walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and drank the whole thing standing at the sink. Then I went back to the study. The rest of the letter took me 3 readings to fully absorb. He'd done this methodically. He'd set up an irrevocable trust in my name when I turned 8, which meant that legally, the money had always been mine. He'd just been the steward of it. He hadn't touched a dollar of it for himself. He'd lived on his pension and Social Security for 12 years, which explained, finally, why we'd been careful with money. Not because there was no money, because he'd refused to use my money for himself. The house was paid off and was also in my name, had been for years, transferred quietly through his attorney. His own savings, modest but real, were also being left to me. And there was a detailed record in the accordion folder of every investment decision he'd made, every statement from the account, every correspondence with the financial advisor, 12 years of meticulous documentation. He'd kept a record of everything so I could see exactly where every dollar had come from and where it had gone. Not one penny missing. At the bottom of the folder was a sealed envelope. On the front, he'd written, "For when you're ready to be angry at me and need to hear why I'm not sorry." I didn't open that one yet. I couldn't. I sat in his study surrounded by 12 years of careful secrets, and I didn't know whether to cry or scream or laugh. I did all three eventually, not all at once. I met with Margaretchen 2 days later. She was in her late 50s, sharp-eyed, with a manner that was warm but precise. She'd worked with my grandfather since shortly after my parents died. She told me he'd sought out an estate attorney early because he'd wanted to do everything right. He was very organized, she said, in a tone that made it clear she didn't say that about most of her clients. She walked me through everything: the trust, the accounts, the house, the few small bequests to his church, and a local food bank. Everything else came to me, cleanly, clearly, without ambiguity. She'd helped him structure it over the years specifically to minimize any legal complexity. "Your grandfather was very specific about one thing," she said, folding her hands on the desk. "He did not want any of your extended family to have access to information about your inheritance before you were prepared to handle any conversations with them." I thought of Aunt Patricia. How many people knew about this? I asked. "To my knowledge, no one," she said. "He was extraordinarily private. He trusted very few people." Did he? I hesitated. Did he know that my mom's family might come around when he died? Margaretchen looked at me over her glasses. "He anticipated it," she said carefully. "He mentioned it more than once. He asked me to make sure you were fully informed and legally protected before anyone could pressure you into decisions you weren't ready to make." He'd seen it coming. Of course he had. He'd seen everything coming. That was who he was. Aunt Patricia called that afternoon. She'd left 3 messages over the past 2 weeks that I hadn't returned, and I'd been vague enough at the funeral that she hadn't been able to pin me down. But now she was calling again, and something in me decided it was time to answer. "Emma, sweetheart, I've been so worried about you." Her voice was warm and caring, the way it always was. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," I said. "Getting through it." Of course. We all are." A pause that was slightly too brief. "Listen, I've been talking with your Uncle Robert and your Aunt Denise, and we think it might be a good idea for us all to get together, as a family, to talk about next steps." "Next steps," I repeated. "Well, the house, for starters. I know you're 18, sweetheart, but that's a lot of responsibility. Managing a property, making decisions about what to do with it. We just want to make sure you have support." I said, "That's really kind of you. We were thinking this weekend, actually. Robert is driving up, and Denise was going to fly in." "This weekend doesn't work for me," I said. A beat of silence. "Oh. Well, when would?" "I've got a lot going on right now," I said pleasantly. "But I appreciate you thinking of me. I'll be in touch." I hung up before she could respond. Then I called Margaretchen and told her I wanted to understand exactly what my rights were if extended family members tried to contest anything. "They have no standing," she said immediately. "None. The trust is ironclad, the house transfer is recorded and registered, and you are the sole beneficiary. There is nothing to contest." "Good," I said. "Can you put that in writing for me?" "Already done," she said. "I'll send it over this afternoon." The family gathering happened anyway. Not because I agreed to it, I didn't. But Aunt Patricia organized a dinner at a restaurant in town 2 weekends later and framed it as a memorial for my grandfather, which made it difficult for me to decline without looking cold. I went. I wore a simple black dress and I sat at that table and I listened, and I did not say anything that wasn't completely controlled. There were 5 of them: Aunt Patricia and her husband, Uncle Robert, Aunt Denise, and a cousin named Blake who was 24 and who I'd met exactly twice in my life. Blake had the particular energy of someone who'd been told his whole life that he was destined for great things and was starting to notice that the great things hadn't arrived yet. The dinner started normally enough. Reminiscing about my grandfather, condolences, how was I holding up? Fine, thank you," I'm doing as well as can be expected. Then, over the main course, Aunt Patricia pivoted. So we've been thinking, she said in her announcing voice, and we really feel like the most sensible thing would be for you to come stay with us for a while. You shouldn't be in that house alone. I appreciate that, I said, but I'm okay where I am. Emma. She set down her fork. You're 18. You just lost the only family you've had for 12 years. The responsible thing is for me to figure out my own situation, I said gently. I have support. I have people I trust. Who? Blake said. Because no offense, but you were kind of isolated up here. It was just you and Gerald. Gerald, I said. Not Grandpa Jerry. He barely knew Blake's name. We have names for him too, I said calmly. I called him Grandpa Jerry. Slight silence. Of course, Aunt Patricia said. We loved him too, you know. I didn't say anything to that. The thing is, Uncle Robert said, and he had a different manner than Patricia. Quieter, more careful, which somehow made him seem more dangerous. The house is going to be a lot to manage on your own. Property taxes, maintenance. And the market in this area has actually gotten quite good. It might be worth talking to a realtor. I'm not selling the house, I said. Robert blinked. Well, not right away, certainly. Not at all, I said. I'm going to live there. Another silence. Longer this time. Emma, Aunt Denise said, leaning forward with a practiced look of concern. Sweetheart, we're just trying to help. We feel terrible that we weren't more present when you were growing up. We want to be here for you now. Your mother would have wanted us to look after you. My mother, whose voice I could barely remember, whose red coat I could still see perfectly, whose exact wishes, as relayed to me through a letter in her father-in-law's handwriting, were for me to grow up knowing who I was without money first. My mother, I said, very carefully, trusted my grandfather completely. And so do I. I appreciate all of you being here tonight. I really do. But I have things handled. Aunt Patricia looked at her husband. Blake looked at the table. Denise looked like she was calculating something. Well, Patricia said after a moment. Of course, whatever you need. We're here. We ordered dessert. We talked about nothing. We paid the bill and hugged in the parking lot and said we'd stay in touch. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a while. Then I went inside and called Margaretchen. I need to understand the timeline for when the trust officially transfers to my control, I said. It's already happening, she said. The paperwork is in process. You should have full access within the next 60 days. And until then? Until then, I'm the trustee. Nothing can be moved or accessed without my signature. Perfect, I said. I'd like to say that what happened next surprised me. It didn't really. 3 weeks after the dinner, I got an email from a name I didn't recognize. A lawyer. Not Margaretchen, someone else. The email was formally worded, dense with legal language, and buried in the middle of it was the core message. A question about whether the circumstances under which the estate was structured might warrant further examination. They were making a move. Not a lawsuit, not yet. A probe. Testing whether I'd get scared, whether I'd reach out to them, whether I was unrepresented and vulnerable. I forwarded the email to Margaretchen without a word. She called me within an hour. This is a fishing expedition, she said. Her voice was clipped and precise. They have no grounds. But I want to respond firmly, so they understand this path leads nowhere. Are you comfortable with that? Very comfortable, I said. She sent a letter. I never saw the full content. She summarized it for me as comprehensive and unambiguous. Whatever it said, I didn't hear from that lawyer again. But the attempt told me something important. Someone in that family had decided I was a target. Someone had looked at me, 18, newly orphaned again, presumably alone and confused, and thought, she doesn't know what she has, and we can use that. They were 12 years too late. Because my grandfather had spent 12 years making sure I was exactly the kind of person who couldn't be used that way. I opened the sealed envelope on a Sunday evening in late April. I'd been putting it off. I knew what it was. He'd labeled it for when you're angry, and I'd had to get through the anger first before I could read it with any kind of clarity. The letter inside was shorter than I expected. Emma, You might be angry that I kept this from you. I hope, in time, you'll understand that I did it because of your mother's wishes, and because I believed she was right. But there's something else I want to say, and I need you to hear it properly. I watched you grow up without money, and I watched you become the most capable, most grounded, most remarkable person I've ever known. You figured out how to work for things, how to wait for things, how to want something and not have it, and survive that feeling. Those are the hardest things there are, and you did them without even knowing you were doing them. The money is yours. It was always yours. Use it wisely, use it freely, and don't let anyone make you feel like you owe them access to it just because they share a last name with your mother. I am prouder of you than I ever found the right words to say while I was alive. I'm sorry about that. You deserve to hear it more. I love you, kiddo. Grandpa Jerry. I folded the letter back up and held it against my chest. And then I cried for about an hour. Not the broken, sleepless grief of the weeks right after he died. Something different. Something that felt, in a way I didn't expect, like relief. The estate transferred fully to my control in late May. On the first day I had access to the account, I sat at his desk in his study with my laptop and looked at the number for a long time. $2,347,819. Plus the house. Plus his modest savings. It wasn't life-changing for generations' wealth. It was enough to build a real life, to have security, to make choices without fear. It was exactly what my parents had intended when they'd taken out those policies. It was exactly what my grandfather had grown it into through 12 years of patience and discipline. I thought about all the things he could have done with it. The vacations he'd skipped. The things he'd denied himself. I thought about him watching YouTube videos about braiding hair at 65 years old. I thought about him sitting in those tiny kindergarten chairs. I opened a new browser tab and started researching the best financial advisors in the area. Then I opened another tab and looked up the college I'd deferred admission to when he'd gotten sick. I'd asked for a 1-year deferral because I hadn't been able to leave him. They'd granted it without question. My spot was still there, waiting. I sent an email confirming I'd be enrolling in the fall. Meanwhile, Aunt Patricia was not giving up. She called twice more. Both times I was brief and polite and noncommittal. She mentioned, with deliberate casualness, that Blake was going through a rough patch and was looking for opportunities. She mentioned, with even more deliberate casualness, that the house was really more than one person needed. I said every time that I appreciated her concern and would keep it in mind. I did not keep it in mind. And then in June, she made a bigger move. She organized a family memorial gathering at the house. My house. She reached out to people, some of them people I'd met at the funeral, some I didn't recognize at all, and invited them to come and honor Gerald's memory. She let me know about this by email, as if it were already arranged. I read the email twice. My house. She'd organized an event at my house without asking me. The old me, the me that had cried into a pillow about secondhand jeans, the me that had been afraid of being difficult or causing conflict, might have let it happen. Might have said okay. Might have opened the door and made coffee and gritted her teeth. But here's the thing about spending 12 years learning patience. You get very good at waiting for exactly the right moment. I called Margaretchen. Can I uninvite someone from my own property? I asked. Completely within your rights, she said immediately. It's your home. You can set any conditions you want. I don't want to uninvite her, I said. I want to let her organize this whole thing and then show up and handle it myself. In front of everyone. A pause. That, said Margaretchen, sounds like something Gerald would have done. The gathering was on a Saturday afternoon in late June. Aunt Patricia had sent out what I can only describe as formal invitations, digital, with a little graphic of flowers and a photo of my grandfather that she'd clearly taken from his obituary. She'd planned a catered lunch. She'd arranged chairs in the backyard. I let her do all of it. I showed up to my own house at 11 in the morning, 2 hours before guests arrived, while Patricia and her husband Gary were setting things up in the backyard. She was surprised to see me. She'd expected me to arrive with everyone else, I think. Emma, I'm so glad you're here early. We could use some help with. This is my house, Aunt Patricia, I said pleasantly. She blinked. I'm going to set some things out inside, I said. Just some things I want to share with people today. She recovered quickly. Of course, of course. Guests arrived throughout the afternoon. Some of them I knew, the church friends, a few neighbors. Some I didn't know at all, people who apparently knew my grandfather but had never been part of my life. Patricia moved through the gathering like a host, greeting people, directing traffic, making sure everyone had food. Gary refilled glasses. Blake stood near the oak tree looking like he was practicing looking thoughtful. About 40 minutes in, when most people had arrived and the gathering had reached a kind of natural social plateau, I walked to the center of the backyard. "Can I have everyone's attention for a moment?" I said. The conversations quieted. I was 18 years old and standing in my grandfather's backyard surrounded by relatives who had mostly been strangers to me, and I was completely calm. "I wanted to thank you all for coming today," I said. "I know my Aunt Patricia organized this, and I appreciate the thought behind it. I wanted to take a few minutes to share some things about my grandfather that I think are worth knowing." I pulled a folder from inside. "My grandfather raised me from the time I was 6 years old," I said. "He did it alone. He didn't have to. He was 65 and he had bad knees and a back that hurt all the time, and he could have let other people figure out what to do with me. Instead, he drove through a snowstorm and put his hand on a table and said I was coming with him." I paused. He was the most principled person I have ever met, and I think that's worth understanding because it's relevant to some things I want to explain today. I saw Aunt Patricia's expression shift slightly. Not alarm exactly. More like calculation. "When my parents died," I said, "they left behind life insurance policies. The total payout was $890,000. I said it clearly, at a normal volume, and watched the ripple go through the gathered people. My grandfather was named as the trustee of that money. He never touched a dollar of it for himself. He invested it carefully, and over 12 years it grew. He lived on his pension and Social Security so that the money he was managing for me would remain intact." Complete silence in the backyard. "I'm telling you all this," I said, "because there have been some suggestions, some conversations, some email exchanges about what should happen with this property and this estate. I want everyone here to be completely clear about where things stand." I opened the folder. "This is documentation of the trust," I said. "This is the property record showing the house was transferred to my name 3 years ago. This is correspondence from my grandfather's attorney regarding the estate. Everything is in order. Everything is legal. And everything belongs to me." I looked at Aunt Patricia. She was very still. "I don't say this to be unkind," I said. "I say it because I think my grandfather would have wanted everyone to understand that he planned this carefully. He thought about it for years. He made sure I was protected. And I intend to honor that by being very clear about what I own and what I'm responsible for." I closed the folder. "That's all I wanted to share," I said. "Please, enjoy the afternoon. The catering is excellent. I won't pretend there wasn't a scene." Aunt Patricia came to find me about 10 minutes later, her voice very controlled and her smile very fixed. "That was quite a speech," she said. "Thank you," I said. "You might have told me. I didn't know what you were planning until you sent me the invitation to my own house," I said. My voice was pleasant. "If you talked to me first, I might have been able to share this information more privately." She opened her mouth, closed it. "Blake is going through a hard time," she said finally. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry to hear that. But that isn't my responsibility." She left not long after that. Gary followed. Blake lasted another 30 minutes, then disappeared without saying goodbye. Aunt Denise came to find me before she left. She was different than I expected, quieter than Patricia, more honest. "I knew Gerald when your parents first got together," she said. "Before everything." She looked at me steadily. "He was exactly what you described. I should have stayed in touch more over the years. I'm sorry that I didn't." I looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," I said. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked. Not the way Patricia had asked, not strategically, just asking. "Yes," I said. "I am." She nodded and left. Margaret Chin called me the following week. "I've heard nothing further from the other attorney," she said. "I don't expect to. I think the situation made itself clear." "I think so too," I said. Your grandfather would have handled it the same way, she said. And there was something in her voice, something that told me she'd been waiting, for weeks or months or longer, to see how I'd turn out. And I'd apparently met some expectations she'd had. I started college in September. I drove myself, loaded my own car, set up my own room. I'd hired a property management company to look after the house while I was away. I wasn't selling it, I was just stepping away for a few years while I built something of my own. The house would be there when I came back. I walked into my first class with a used laptop, not because I couldn't afford a new one, but because the used one worked fine, and I'd grown up learning that working fine was enough, and sat down and opened my notebook. The girl next to me glanced at the laptop and then glanced away, and I thought, she doesn't know. She has no idea who I am or what I've been through or what's sitting in a trust account with my name on it. To her, I'm just another freshman with a worn laptop. Good. I want to be known for who I am first. My grandfather taught me that. I'm 20 now. The account has grown. I'm studying finance, not because I'm obsessed with money, but because I want to understand the thing my grandfather spent 12 years managing for me. I want to understand the decisions he made, the strategy behind each one. I've been going through his records, all of them, every statement, every trade, and it's like reading his mind. Like getting to know a side of him I never saw while he was alive. He was good at it. Better than I knew. He'd had a financial advisor, but the decisions were his. The advisor told me that himself, when I reached out to him. Gerald was very involved, very informed, very patient. Patient. That was the word he used. Gerald was extraordinarily patient. Aunt Patricia and I are cordial. Nothing more. She stopped pushing after the gathering in the backyard, which told me everything I needed to know about what the interest had actually been. Blake, I've heard, is doing better. Working somewhere, on his feet again. I hope that's true. I have no anger toward him specifically. He was just someone who got pointed in the wrong direction. Aunt Denise sent me a card at Christmas. Just a card, nothing else. A photo of my mother as a child inside, one I'd never seen. My mom maybe 5 or 6 years old, grinning at the camera, squinting against the sun. I have it propped up on my desk. The other day, I was on the phone with a classmate who was stressed about money, about tuition, about whether she'd chosen the right path. And she said, frustrated and a little embarrassed, I just feel like I'm always behind. Like everyone else has things figured out that I don't. And I thought about secondhand jeans, about a cracked phone screen, about crying into a pillow at night over things that turned out not to matter the way I thought they did. You're not behind, I told her. You're just learning who you are first. Everything else comes after. She was quiet for a second. That's actually really helpful, she said. Where did you hear that? I looked at the photo on my desk, my mom as a child, squinting at the sun. From someone who knew what he was doing, I said. Even when I didn't understand it yet. He slammed his hand on a table when I was 6 years old and told the room I was coming with him. And then for 12 years, quietly, carefully, patiently, he made sure I was ready. I am ready, Grandpa Jerry. I finally understand everything you did. And I'm going to make it mean something.